in the public service broadcaster, but also for the vast majority of ordinary workers in RT and journalists who have had to endure pay cuts, pay freezes, precarious contracts, while they then discover that secret payments are being made to a top broadcaster that are not even disclosed. And we want to extend our full support and solidarity with the ordinary RT journalists and RT workers who are out protesting today, because it is absolutely vital in this scandal of governance over secret payments to one broadcaster and whoever was involved in RT, that public service broadcasting and the ordinary journalists and staff in RT don't become the victims of the wrongs that were done by a small minority at the top. And we need to lance this boil urgently. And that means full disclosure now by the RT board and executives about exactly who sanctioned these payments. We know from Dee Forbes that she's admitting that she sanctioned these secret payments from 2019 onwards, but that others were involved in sanctioning payments prior to that. So we need absolutely full disclosure and full transparency about all these payments, who was involved, and that should be published now. We shouldn't have to wait for it to be managed, a managed message at committees. The journalists and staff who are out protesting, who've done absolutely nothing wrong, in fact, who are substantial victims of this scandal, deserve the facts, truth, full transparency and accountability now, and then we will have the questioning at the committee. And it shouldn't be just Dee Forbes who comes in, but anybody who was involved. She has said that there were legal and financial people, and there were other people before her who were involved in sanctioning these payments. So absolutely everybody who was in any way involved with sanctioning these secret payments should have to come before the committee and be held accountable. And we also think the Minister needs to come into the Dáil and make, first of all, clear to RT there has to be full disclosure and transparency immediately, but we also don't think some sort of 7-month review is any way acceptable way to deal with this. We need to lance the boil now. We need full disclosure, full transparency, and we need a proper discussion about the funding of public service broadcasting, because we absolutely defend the public service broadcasting as a principle, and a huge part of the problem here revolves around the financing of public service broadcasting and the failure to properly finance it. The licence fee, in our view, was always the wrong way to do it. I mean, the idea that we finance public service broadcasting through a flat regressive tax where people can potentially get jailed if they don't pay it is not the right way to fund public service broadcasting. And of course, the whole thing also raises serious questions about the involvement of commercial interests making payments to presenters, really compromising the integrity of the public service broadcaster. So our view is we need an immediate discussion about how we properly fund public service broadcasting, and in our view that would involve capping the salaries of people at the very top of the organisation and having central funding for the public service broadcasting where it is not compromised by commercial interests or advertising interests who are compromising the integrity of what is a vital part of our public service and democracy in this country. So I think that covers it. Yeah.
Okay. I think the government's attempt to use the so-called consultative forums to manufacture consent for the creeping elimination of what is left of our neutrality is falling flat on its face. I think public opinion has seen the reality of what the sham consultative forums are about. I think we can thank the various anti-war protesters who have turned up at the consultative forums to expose the agenda that's being pushed there. We can thank the President, Michael D. Higgins, for his intervention And we can thank those of us in the Dáil who have spoken out about the government's agenda and about these consultative forums for exposing that. However, I don't think we should be complacent in any way. I think the government's war on neutrality continues. The report coming from the consultative forums is going to be a part of that. It is extremely likely that the report and the next step of the government is going to be to try to eliminate the triple lock. And that is an integral part of the attempt of the government to diminish what is left of neutrality and to align Ireland progressively more and more with NATO. I saw Harry McGee was writing in the Irish Times and said, these forums, they're not about neutrality, they're not about NATO, and then his concluding paragraph is, now attention is going to turn to the triple lock. The triple lock is intimately connected to the issue of neutrality. You can go back 20 years. The Fine Gael policy document Beyond Neutrality 20 years ago described the triple lock as a political straitjacket. It's something that restricts the ability of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the establishment parties in this country, to send troops, Irish troops, abroad to participate in imperialist adventures. If it wasn't for the triple lock, instead of Ireland participating in the war on Iraq and Afghanistan by allowing the use of Shannon Airport, then those governments, which were clearly sympathetic to the aims of US imperialism, could have sent Irish troops abroad to participate in those conflicts that the vast majority of people in this country were opposed to. So we think this is the next step in terms of what the government is aiming at in terms of trying to erode what is left of neutrality. One of the positive things that has come out of the discussion over the last couple of weeks, I think, is a growing movement of people reflecting in bigger and bigger attendances at the various anti-war meetings across the country. Hundreds of people now having attended different meetings, different protests. That's very positive, and for us shows how we can build a movement to defend neutrality representing the viewpoint of the majority of people in this country. Second thing, just very briefly, is to highlight that we will be voting against the extension of the Offences Against the State Act. We are of the opinion, as we have been and consistently for every year, that the very idea of non-jury trials for serious offences is repugnant to the very basic principles of democracy, of access to justice. People should have the right to trial by jury. The various reasons, given for this in terms of intimidation and so on, don't stack up, particularly today in terms of the ability to have remote juries. We're also against other aspects, which, for example, unfortunately, the majority report on the Offences Against the State Act recommend the continuation of the idea that a Garda's belief can be evidence, and significant evidence, in the special criminal court. We don't allow that elsewhere. We allow Garda statements to be challenged and so on, as opposed to simply accepting a Garda's belief as equivalent to fact. So we'll be voting against the continuation of the special criminal court. We're disappointed to see that Sinn Féin is now in favour of a non-jury court, but simply placing it on a kind of permanent legislative basis as opposed to this yearly thing. We think that amnesty is still correct, the ICCL is still correct, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission are still correct, the UN Special Rapporteur are still correct, that a non-jury trial is utterly wrong. I would say, even to Sinn Féin, in terms of their current position, which is to say, well, we support the majority report, they've got an amendment down that's going to be voted down by the government, that even in terms of the logic of their own position, they should still vote against the extension of the Offences Against the State Act.
So I want to deal with two issues. One, the issue of the Security Forum, and two, the question of the Offences Against the State Act, and maybe add a few points to the points that have been raised. First of all, on the Security Forum. 2 weeks ago, in the Dáil, we challenged the government on the Speaker's lineup for the forum. We said that it was rigged. We said that it was stacked. All right? I think nearly 2 weeks on, the efforts that we made to explain to the public that this forum was a rigged forum, that it wasn't a genuine debate, have in large measure been successful. I think that Micheál Martin's forum has flopped. It's been a flop for the government. And I think that's down to two reasons. One is, I agree with Paul, the efforts of peace activists, young people, campaigners around the country in the last week have been important in showing that to be the case. But I think there's another group that needs to be taxed that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is the government themselves, right? Because the government themselves denied that the speakers list at the forum was stacked, but they never offered anything remotely like a detailed rebuttal of the point that was made. We said it was 5-1. They never offered anything remotely like a detailed rebuttal of that. And how could they? Because it would have flown in the face of the facts. And I think a lot of people got that. And I think in terms of winning the hearts and minds of people in this country on this round, and that's all it is in a wider battle, I think the people who are standing up to the government's agenda and ourselves here in the Dáil have achieved a significant degree of success in relation to that. We want to register that because the forum finishes today and there'll be a certain amount of analysis afterwards. Then briefly in terms of the Special Criminal Court, I mean, in its most recent iteration, the Offences Against the State Act dates back to the first years of the Troubles. The government said that there was a national emergency in the country. The idea that, you know, in 2023, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and, to their shame, the Green Party would be renewing such legislation, it's not a defensible position in our view. In a society that purports to be democratic, where civil rights, civil liberties are valued, it's not compatible with non-jury courts in our view. But we're not surprised with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in relation to that. We do want to make some comment in relation to Sinn Féin, right? Sinn Féin's voters, certainly many of the ones that I've been speaking to over the weekend about this, in large measure, in many cases, are not happy about the fact that Sinn Féin look like they're going to abstain on a vote on renewing the Offences Against the State Act for another year, and are embracing, Pa Dáil said it was a game changer, the majority report, which would keep non-jury courts in perpetuity, not even up for an annual debate and an annual vote. Keep them with some amendments in perpetuity. Non-jury courts in Irish society, that is just, it's not something that anyone who is a consistent supporter of human rights, civil rights, democratic rights, civil liberties can stand over. And we want to draw attention to that. We will be asking questions of Sinn Féin on this issue over the next 24-48 hours.
Okay, so about a year and a half ago I introduced a bill into the Dáil to ban planning of data centres from the Planning and Development Act, and it was defeated in the Dáil by a vote that the government voted down on. And at the time, when we looked at the issue, there were 75 data centres, mega data centres in the country. They were using up about 13 to 14% of the energy on the national grid. And today, as I go to reintroduce the same bill, we now know that we have 84 data centres and that they're using up 18% of the energy from the national grid. There are 16 more applications have been granted. There are 8 more in the planning process, and by 2030 it is estimated that data centres will use 30% of the national grid. And basically we simply cannot allow this sector to guzzle up our energy and indeed our water resources, because they use a huge amount of water every day in the process of cooling the centres. And we were told a lie by the government that these would be independently powered and that much of the heat from them would be brought back into the community. That isn't happening, and it certainly won't happen at a rate that's fast enough and fit enough for what is actually happening here. Instead, we're finding out increasingly that big tech and the business sector are using your data, my data, to package it and sell the algorithms to other companies to produce stuff that they can get you to buy. And this is increasingly the case, that our behaviour and our individual information is being commodified and monetised in order to produce more goods for sale. So this is unacceptable, that we're risking the national grid, and we're consuming water supplies at such a rate that will also, particularly during an increasingly hotter climate, risk our access to clean, fresh, clean water. I think I would just want to make a comment on this, that it is disgraceful that Eamon Ryan is attempting to greenwash this sector and to give big tech a free pass. It's impossible and unfair and wrong for him to lecture ordinary people on changing their behaviour when he allows the behaviour of this particular sector to go through the roof. And the last thing to say is, I looked at a webinar last night that showed us that Denmark is also considered a hub for data centres, and currently the Danish national grid is giving over 4% of all its energy to data centres, and it's going up. And they're very worried that it may go as far as 6 or 7%. So when you put it by comparison to what we're doing here in this country, it makes us look pathetically weak in defending our natural resources and looking after the interests of the state. If Denmark are worried at 5 and 6% of the national grid, what is wrong with Ireland that we're still allowing it going ahead to 30% of the national grid in the next 5 years or so? So that bill will be introduced again today.